Elena's hands trembled as she held the journal up to the bare bulb hanging from the basement ceiling. The leather binding was soft with age, but the pages inside looked impossibly fresh. She flipped to a random entry and felt her stomach drop. March 15th, 1952. Tommy lost another tooth today. I found him trying to wiggle the loose one next to it, hoping the tooth fairy would come twice in 1 week. Margaret says I spoil him, but what's the harm in a little magic? The house feels so quiet without children's laughter. The handwriting was hers. Not similar, identical. Every loop of the G, every slant of the Y, even the way she dotted her I's with small circles instead of dots. A habit her mother had tried to break when Elena was 7. She slammed the journal shut and scrambled up the narrow wooden ladder, her injured shoulder screaming in protest. The hidden room could wait. Everything could wait. She needed air, needed to think, needed to pretend she hadn't just found evidence of a life that couldn't possibly be hers. The main floor felt like a sanctuary after the claustrophobic space below. Elena had discovered the room purely by accident. A loose floorboard had given way when she'd been pulling up the water-damaged planks near the window. What should have been crawl space or foundation had instead revealed a 6 by 8 foot room with a ceiling just tall enough for a child to stand upright. The toys down there were arranged with careful precision. A red wagon without a speck of rust, building blocks sorted by color, dolls with their hair still perfectly curled, everything covered in a fine layer of dust, but preserved as if waiting for children who would never come home. "Mom?" Sophia's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Did you find anything interesting down there?" Elena shoved the journal behind a paint can and forced her voice to sound steady. "Just some old junk, nothing worth keeping." She found Sophia making dinner, if mac and cheese from a box could be called dinner. Her 17-year-old daughter had inherited Elena's dark hair, but her father's stubborn chin currently set in the expression that meant she had questions Elena wasn't ready to answer. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sophia said, not looking up from stirring the pot. Closer than you know, Elena thought, but said, "Just tired. This place takes more work than I expected." "Everything takes more work than you expect lately." Sophia's tone carried the particular brand of exasperation that only teenagers could perfect. "Maybe we should have stayed in Reno. Maybe this whole fresh start in the middle of nowhere thing was a mistake." Elena leaned against the doorframe, studying her daughter's profile. Sophia had been different since they'd moved here 3 weeks ago. Quieter during the day, restless at night. The sleepwalking had started their second night in the house. Elena had found her standing in the living room at 3 a.m., staring at the exact spot where the hidden room lay beneath loose floorboards. "You've been having the dreams again," Elena said. It wasn't a question. Sophia's stirring slowed. "They're not dreams exactly, more like memories that don't belong to me. I see children playing in that living room, but it's different. Brighter. There's furniture we don't have, pictures on walls that are bare now." A chill ran down Elena's spine. What kind of children? A boy and a girl. Maybe 8 and 10? The boy has freckles and keeps losing teeth. The girl likes to read by the window. Sophia finally looked at her mother. "It sounds crazy, doesn't it?" No crazier than finding a journal written in your own handwriting, Elena thought. Out loud, she said, "We're both adjusting to a new place. Old houses have a way of getting into your head. Is that what happened to the other owners, the ones who left so fast?" Elena didn't have an answer for that. The real estate agent had been vague about the property's history, mentioning only that it had changed hands frequently and that some people weren't suited for rural living. At the time, Elena had assumed it was the isolation that drove people away, the crushing silence that made you hyper-aware of every creak and groan the old house made. Now she wondered if there were other reasons. Sophia served the mac and cheese on paper plates. They still hadn't unpacked most of their kitchen supplies. They ate in relative quiet, the only sounds their forks scraping ceramic and the wind starting to pick up outside. Weather reports predicted another storm moving in from the mountains, and Elena made a mental note to check the generator fuel. "Mom?" Sophia's voice was smaller now, younger. Do you think Dad would have liked this place? Elena's chest tightened. David had been gone for 2 years, but Sophia still asked these questions sometimes, as if trying to keep her father present in the decisions that shaped their lives. I think he would have loved a space, Elena said honestly. Remember how he always talked about having room for a garden? We've got 40 acres now. Sophia nodded but didn't look convinced. Outside, the wind was building into something that sounded almost like voices calling from far away. That night, Elena lay awake listening to the house settle around them. Every creak of the old timbers made her think of the journal hidden in the basement, of handwriting that couldn't possibly be hers, describing a life that had never happened. The wind had grown stronger, rattling the windows in their frames and sending something, a loose shutter maybe, banging against the side of the house with metronomic persistence. She reached for the bottle of prescription pain medication on her nightstand, then stopped herself. The pills helped with her shoulder, with the constant ache that radiated down her arm from the accident, but they also made her groggy, made her lose time. She couldn't afford to lose any more time than she already was. The sleepwalking had started a few days after they'd moved in. Elena would go to bed in her room and wake up somewhere else in the house, once in the kitchen with a cup of tea she didn't remember making, another time standing at the living room window, staring out at the dark expanse of sagebrush. But it was this morning that truly frightened her. She'd awakened in the basement, sitting on the floor beside the hidden room, her fingernails dirty as if she'd been digging. Down the hall, Sophia's door opened. Elena held her breath, waiting to see if her daughter would walk to the bathroom or start that strange, purposeful wandering that had become so familiar. Footsteps moved past Elena's door, heading toward the living room. Elena slipped out of bed and followed, her bare feet silent on the cold, hardwood floors. Sophia stood in the exact same spot as before, her thin frame silhouetted against the window. But tonight she wasn't just standing. She was having a conversation. "I know you're scared," Sophia whispered to the empty room, "but Mama will find you soon. She always finds you when you get lost." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Sophia's voice was different, younger, with a slight accent Elena couldn't place. Not the measured teenage cadence Elena knew so well. "Sophia?" Elena whispered. Her daughter turned, and for a moment Elena saw a stranger's face. Round cheeks, different nose, eyes that held the particular brightness of childhood wonder. Then Sophia blinked, and it was just her own daughter again, confused and embarrassed. "Did I do it again?" Sophia asked, her normal voice returning. Elena nodded, wrapping an arm around Sophia's shoulders and guiding her back to bed. But as they passed through the living room, Elena could swear she heard something, a child's laughter, faint and echoing, coming from somewhere beneath their feet. Morning brought no relief from the strangeness. Elena sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, ostensibly working on the disability paperwork that seemed to multiply rather than diminish, but really researching the house's history. The county records were frustratingly sparse, built in 1923 by someone named William Hartwell, sold in 1954 after Hartwell's death, then a confusing series of ownership transfers that made little sense. Names appeared and disappeared with no explanation, sale dates that contradicted each other, property descriptions that sometimes mentioned outbuildings that didn't exist. What troubled Elena most was the gap. From 1943 to 1954, there was no record of anyone living here. No tax payments, no utility connections, no census data, as if the house had simply vanished from official existence for 11 years. Sophia shuffled into the kitchen around 10, her dark hair tangled from sleep, wearing one of David's old MIT sweatshirts that hung nearly to her knees. It had become her uniform since they'd moved here, a security blanket that smelled faintly of her father's cologne, though that was probably Elena's imagination by now. "Any luck with the internet?" Sophia asked, peering over Elena's shoulder at the laptop screen. "Spotty. The satellite connection doesn't like this weather." Elena closed the browser window quickly, not wanting Sophia to see the search terms: house history, Dusty Creek, and unexplained memory loss, Nevada, and, in a moment of desperation, can houses be haunted by people who are still alive? I was thinking about calling Grandma Rosa, Sophia said, settling into the chair across from Elena. Just to check in. Maybe talk about Dad. Elena's chest tightened. Her mother-in-law had been their anchor after David's death, but Rosa lived in Phoenix now, in an assisted living facility that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. Rosa had been against the move to Nevada from the beginning, had accused Elena of running away from David's memory instead of facing it. Maybe Rosa had been right. That's a good idea, Elena said, though the thought of explaining their current situation to Rosa made her stomach clench. How could she tell David's mother that she was losing pieces of herself in this house, that she was finding evidence of children who had never existed, that her own daughter was sleepwalking and speaking in voices that didn't belong to her? Sophia was watching her with David's too perceptive eyes. Mom, are you okay? Really okay? Because you've been acting strange since we found that room, and I'm starting to worry. The lights flickered, then went out completely. Outside, the wind howled like something wounded and wild, and somewhere beneath the floorboards, Elena could swear she heard the sound of children playing. In the sudden darkness, Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. The house groaned around them, as if the wind might tear it from its foundation, but underneath that sound, faint but unmistakable, came the rhythmic thump of a ball bouncing and the bright peal of children's laughter. Mom? Sophia's voice was tight with fear. Do you hear that? Elena's mouth had gone dry. She reached across the table, finding Sophia's hand in the darkness. The generator, she managed. I need to check the generator. But neither of them moved. The sounds from below grew clearer. Running footsteps, a child calling ready or not, "Here I come!" and then giggling that seemed to rise through the floorboards like smoke. Sophia's grip tightened. That's them, the children from my dreams. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness as Elena's phone lit up with an incoming call. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Elena stared at the screen, paralyzed by an inexplicable dread. Answer it, Sophia whispered. Elena's finger hovered over the screen. The phone rang again, its shrill tone somehow wrong in the heavy darkness. On the fourth ring, she finally accepted the call. Elena? The voice was female, elderly, crackling with bad reception. Elena Vasquez? Yes, thank God. This is Dorothy Hartwell. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Elena felt Sophia stiffen beside her. I don't know anyone by that name. William Hartwell was my grandfather-in-law. He built your house. The woman's voice carried an urgency that made Elena's skin crawl. You need to get out of there. Tonight, before the anniversary. What anniversary? But even as Elena asked, she somehow knew. The date from the journal entry floated through her mind. March 15th, 1952. Today was March 15th. Listen to me carefully, Dorothy continued, her voice breaking up as the storm intensified. The children, Tommy and Margaret, they disappeared from that house 70 years ago today. Their mother, Sarah, wrote about it in her journal, how they were there one moment and gone the next. No bodies ever found, no trace of where they went. Elena's blood turned to ice. Sarah's journal? But that's impossible. The handwriting is yours, isn't it? Dorothy's voice was barely audible now through the static. Sarah had the same gift, the same curse. She could see what happened in that house, write about lives that existed in the spaces between reality and memory. But it drove her mad in the end. She spent her last years in an asylum, writing about children who called to her through the walls. The phone signal crackled and faded, Dorothy's voice becoming fragments, the room under the floor, and they're waiting for someone, and finally, clearly, to take their place. The line went dead. In the silence that followed, Elena could hear her own ragged breathing and Sophia's sharp intake of air. But the sounds from below had stopped. The house felt suddenly hollow, as if it were holding its breath. "Mom," Sophia said quietly, "my dreams. They weren't dreams at all, were they?" Before Elena could answer, a new sound began, footsteps directly above them, in Elena's bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps that moved from the bed to the window and back again. But they were the only two people in the house. Elena grabbed her daughter's hand. "We're leaving. Now." But as she stood, the footsteps upstairs stopped, and something else began. A child's voice, thin and pleading, seemed to rise from the walls themselves. "Mama? Mama, where are you? We've been waiting so long." Sophia gasped. "That's the boy, Tommy. He's been calling for his mother in my dreams." Elena's mind raced. Dorothy's warning about the anniversary, the journal entries in her own handwriting describing a life she'd never lived, Sophia's increasingly frequent episodes of speaking in voices that weren't her own. The pieces formed a pattern too terrifying to fully comprehend. "Please, Mama." The voice came again, closer now. "We just want to go home." Elena looked at her daughter, seeing David's determined eyes staring back at her. Sophia was no longer the frightened teenager who'd been woken by power outages. Something had shifted in her expression, a resolve Elena recognized from her years in the emergency room, the look of someone preparing to make an impossible choice. "What if they need our help?" Sophia asked quietly. "What if they've been trapped here all these years, waiting for someone who could hear them?" "Sophia, no. We don't understand what's happening here. It's not safe." But even as Elena said it, she thought of the journal upstairs, hidden behind the paint can. The detailed entries about children who loved and laughed and lost teeth and read by windows. They weren't just phantom voices or figments of imagination. They had been real. They had lived. And now they were calling for help. Elena stood at the crossroads of everything she'd once believed about reality, about safety, about the nature of what was possible. Behind her lay the door and escape. Ahead lay a mystery that might cost her sanity or her daughter's life. The choice, she realized, had already been made the moment she'd opened that journal. Elena's hands trembled as she stared at her daughter in the darkness. The weight of Dorothy Hartwell's warning pressed against her chest like a stone, but Sophia's determined expression, so achingly similar to David's when he'd made up his mind about something, made her feel like she was drowning. "We're leaving," Elena said again, but her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. "Get your things. We'll drive to town, find a motel." "And then what?" Sophia's voice was steady, older than her 17 years. "We run away and spend the rest of our lives wondering what would have happened if we'd stayed, if we'd tried to help?" Elena wanted to scream that yes, that's exactly what they should do, that running was the smart choice, the safe choice, the choice that didn't involve risking Sophia's life for the sake of children who had been dead for 70 years. But her daughter's words echoed her own worst fears, the same crushing doubt that had haunted her since David's death, the constant question of whether she was brave enough to face the impossible or if she would always choose the path of least resistance. "You don't understand," Elena said, hating how desperate she sounded. "This isn't like your father's research, Sophia. This isn't a problem we can solve with logic and determination. Dorothy said Sarah went insane. She died in an asylum, writing about voices only she could hear." Sophia took a step closer, and in the dim glow of Elena's phone light, her face looked ghostly pale. But what if Sarah wasn't crazy? What if she was the only one brave enough to listen? The question hit Elena like a physical blow. How many times had she wondered the same thing about her own mother? Carmen Vasquez had spent Elena's childhood talking to people who weren't there, leaving food for invisible visitors, insisting that the walls held memories that only she could see. Elena had been 8 when social services finally stepped in, 15 when her mother died alone in a state facility, still writing letters to phantom correspondents. "I won't let that happen to you," Elena whispered. But even as she said it, she could feel the horrible irony. Sophia was already hearing voices, already speaking words that belonged to someone else. And Elena Elena was writing in journals about a life she'd never lived, losing chunks of time, waking up in rooms she didn't remember entering. Maybe the madness was hereditary after all. "Mom." Sophia's voice was gentle now, the way it had been when she was small and trying to comfort Elena after a bad day at the hospital. "Look at me. Really look at me." Elena forced herself to meet her daughter's eyes, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Sophia wasn't afraid. Concerned, yes. Worried about Elena, absolutely. But not afraid of whatever was happening in this house. "I've been dreaming about them for weeks," Sophia said quietly. "Tommy and Margaret. I see them playing in that room downstairs, and they're not scary or threatening. They're just lost. They've been lost for 70 years, and they're tired of waiting. Waiting for what? For someone who can see them. Someone who can help them understand what happened." Sophia paused, her expression growing more serious. "Someone like us." Elena closed her eyes, but behind her lids she could still see the journal pages written in her own handwriting, entries about birthday parties and scraped knees and bedtime stories, details so vivid and specific that part of her had begun to wonder if she was remembering rather than imagining. What if the boundary between past and present was thinner in this house? What if some places held on to their histories so tightly that sensitive people could slip between the cracks of time itself? "The pain medication," Elena said suddenly, opening her eyes. "My prescription. The sleepwalking started after I began taking it regularly." Sophia frowned. "You think the pills are causing this?" "Not causing it, but maybe lowering my defenses, making me more susceptible to whatever's happening here." Elena thought about the mornings she'd awakened with dirt under her fingernails, the lost hours, the way reality felt fluid and uncertain when the medication was in her system. "Your father always said that consciousness was more fragile than people wanted to believe. So what are you saying?" Elena looked around the kitchen, at their half-unpacked boxes and paper plates, at the life they'd tried to build in this place that seemed to exist outside normal time. She thought about the insurance settlement still sitting in her account. Enough money to start over somewhere else, somewhere safe and predictable and utterly ordinary. Then she thought about David, about the way he'd always chosen the difficult questions over the easy answers, even when it meant years of failed experiments and professional ridicule. What would he do in her place? "I'm saying," Elena said slowly, "that maybe we need to understand what we're dealing with before we make any decisions, but carefully and together. And the very moment, I think you're in real danger, we leave. No arguments, no negotiations." Sophia nodded solemnly. "Deal." Outside, the storm raged with renewed fury, and somewhere in the darkness between the walls, children who had been waiting 70 years for someone to hear them finally had their answer. Elena stood in the darkness of her kitchen, her daughter's hand warm in hers, and felt the last of her rational resistance crumble like autumn leaves. The decision settled into her bones with a finality that both terrified and liberated her. There would be no more running, no more pretending that normal explanations could account for what was happening in this house. "We need supplies," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Flashlights, batteries, notebooks. And I need to stop taking the pain medication, at least temporarily. If it's affecting my perception, I need to know what we're really dealing with." Sophia squeezed her hand. "What about your back?" Elena thought about the constant ache that had become her unwelcome companion since the accident, the way her spine felt like broken glass when she moved wrong. But she also thought about waking up in the hidden room with no memory of how she'd gotten there, about the journal entries that appeared in her handwriting, like messages from a ghost. "I'll manage," she said. "Your father used to say that pain was just information. Maybe it's time I started listening to what my body is actually telling me instead of numbing it into silence." They spent the next hour preparing by the light of Elena's phone and an emergency lantern she'd found in the utility room. Elena gathered every flashlight in the house, checked batteries, and created a detailed timeline in a notebook, every strange incident since they'd moved in. Every lost hour, every moment Sophia had spoken in voices that weren't her own. As she wrote, patterns began to emerge. The episodes always happened at night. They were more frequent during storms, and they seemed to center around the hidden room beneath the floorboards, as if that space was somehow the heart of whatever was happening here. "Mom, look at this." Sophia had retrieved the journal from Elena's bedroom and was flipping through the pages. The handwriting. It changes. Elena leaned over her daughter's shoulder, studying the entries more carefully than she had before. Sophia was right. While all the writing was recognizably Elena's, there were subtle variations. Some passages were written in her usual neat script, while others showed looser, more childlike curves. A few entries appeared to have been written by someone whose hand was shaking. "Different emotional states," Elena murmured, her nurse's training kicking in. "Or different levels of consciousness. Look, the shaky handwriting corresponds to the dates I was taking higher doses of medication." Sophia pointed to one particular entry, dated just 3 days ago. The writing was so loose it was barely legible. "Margaret won't eat her breakfast. Says the oatmeal tastes like sadness. Tommy told her stories are just memories that haven't happened yet, but that made her cry harder. I don't know how to comfort children who exist in the spaces between heartbeats." Elena stared at the words, a chill running down her spine. She had no memory of writing them, but they felt true in a way that made her chest ache. "We need to go to the room," Sophia said quietly. "Tonight, during the storm. That's when they're strongest, isn't it?" Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist they wait until morning, until the storm passed, until she felt more prepared for whatever they might find. But she could feel time slipping away like water through her fingers. Dorothy's warning echoed in her mind before the anniversary. They had hours, maybe less. "Together," Elena said firmly. "Whatever we find down there, we face it together. And if either of us feels like we're losing ourselves, if we start acting like someone else, or losing time, or hearing things that feel too real, we pull each other out. Promise me. Promise." Elena took a shaky breath, tasting copper and fear on her tongue. Her back was already beginning to protest the absence of her usual evening medication, a familiar burning that would only intensify as the hours passed. But for the first time since David's death, she felt truly awake, alert, present in her own life, instead of drifting through it like a ghost. They gathered their supplies, flashlights, notebooks, bottles of water, Elena's phone with its dying battery. At the last moment, Elena grabbed David's old digital recorder from a box of his research equipment. If they were going to document whatever happened in that room, they needed to do it properly. As they stood at the top of the stairs leading down to the living room, Elena felt the weight of crossing an invisible threshold. Behind them lay safety, skepticism, the comfortable boundaries of everything she'd once believed about reality. Ahead lay a mystery that might cost them everything. But as another child's voice drifted up from below, faint and pleading and achingly real, Elena realized she had already made her choice. Some journeys, once begun, could only move forward. "Ready?" she whispered to Sophia. Her daughter nodded, David's determined expression flickering across her features like candlelight. Together, they descended into the darkness where 70 years of waiting was finally about to end. The living room felt different in the storm-dark night, as if the familiar furniture had rearranged itself into foreign configurations while they'd been upstairs planning. Elena's flashlight beam swept across the overturned boards she'd pried up days earlier, revealing the entrance to the hidden room like a wound in the floor. "The air feels thicker here," Sophia whispered, her own flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Elena knew what her daughter meant. The atmosphere seemed dense with accumulated time, heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. Each breath tasted of dust and sorrow and something else, something that reminded her of the pediatric ward at the hospital, that particular mixture of hope and heartbreak that came from caring for the vulnerable. They knelt beside the opening, and Elena clicked on David's digital recorder. "March 15th, 11:47 p.m., she said quietly. Elena and Sofia Vasquez investigating anomalous activity in the hidden room beneath 1847 Sagebrush Road. The formality of it helped steady her nerves, made this feel less like madness and more like the kind of methodical investigation David would have conducted. Sofia went first, lowering herself through the opening with the fluid grace of youth. Elena followed more carefully, her back protesting every movement. Without the cushion of medication, each twist sent fire up her spine, but the pain brought an unexpected gift: absolute clarity. For the first time in months, her mind felt sharp, unfogged by chemical interference. The hidden room seemed larger than Elena remembered, stretching back into shadows that their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate. The toys were still arranged exactly as she'd found them: the wooden train set, the porcelain doll with her patient smile, the stack of children's books with their bright covers. But now Elena could see details that had escaped her notice before. "Look at the dust patterns," Sofia said, crouching beside the toy box. "Everything else in this room is covered in decades of grime, but these toys, they're almost clean." Elena ran her finger along the edge of the wooden train. Sofia was right. While the rest of the room bore the accumulation of 70 years, the toys seemed somehow preserved, as if invisible hands had been caring for them all this time. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath misting in the air. Elena's flashlight flickered, and in that moment of wavering light, she could have sworn she saw two small figures playing in the corner. A boy pushing the wooden train along imaginary tracks, while a girl in a faded blue dress arranged furniture in a dollhouse that wasn't there. "Did you see?" Sofia began, but her words were cut off by a sound that made Elena's blood freeze. Footsteps above them, moving through the living room. Slow, measured steps that definitely belonged to an adult. Elena grabbed Sofia's arm. "Someone's in the house." They listened, barely breathing, as the footsteps continued their circuit above, back and forth across the living room, pausing occasionally as if the walker were examining something. Elena's mind raced through possibilities: Dorothy Hartwell coming to warn them in person, a neighbor checking on them during the storm, someone with less benign intentions. But then the footsteps stopped directly above the opening to the hidden room, and a voice drifted down. A woman's voice, warm and familiar, calling out with the particular tone of a mother summoning her children. "Tommy, Margaret, it's time for supper, darlings." Elena felt the world tilt sideways. She knew that voice. Impossible as it seemed, she recognized it the way she recognized her own heartbeat, with an intimacy that bypassed rational thought entirely. It was her own voice. Sofia's eyes widened in the flashlight beam. "Mom, you didn't—" "That's not me," Elena whispered, but even as she said it, doubt crept in like ice water. Was it possible she'd been sleepwalking again, that some part of her consciousness had split off and was now wandering through the house above? The voice called again, closer now, as if the speaker were kneeling beside the opening. "Children? I know you're down there. Please come up. I have fresh bread and honey just the way you like it." Elena pressed her hand to her throat, feeling the vibrations of her own breathing, confirming that the words weren't coming from her. But the voice was undeniably hers, not similar, not reminiscent, but identical in every inflection and cadence. "We need to go up there," Sofia said, her voice tight with fear and fascination. "We need to see what's happening." Elena wanted to refuse, wanted to grab her daughter and escape through the opening, run to the car and drive until this haunted house was nothing but a nightmare in their rearview mirror. But as they sat frozen in indecision, the temperature in the hidden room plummeted further, and two distinct child voices began to answer the call from above. "Coming, Mama," they said in unison, their words echoing off the earthen walls. "We're coming home." The voices seemed to emanate from Sofia's throat. Elena's hand flew to Sofia's mouth, but her daughter wasn't speaking. Her lips were pressed together in shocked silence, even as the children's voices continued to pour from her throat like water from a broken dam. The sound was impossible, two distinct vocal patterns emerging simultaneously from one person, layering over each other in harmonies that belonged to the 1950s. "Sofia," Elena whispered urgently. But her daughter's eyes had gone distant, unfocused, as if she were looking at something beyond the earthen walls of the hidden room. Above them, Elena's own voice responded with maternal warmth. "That's my good children. Wash your hands first. You know how dirty you get playing in the garden." The footsteps resumed overhead, moving toward what Elena assumed was the kitchen. But the layout was wrong. The steps suggested rooms that didn't exist in her house, a floor plan from another time entirely. Elena realized with growing horror that whatever was happening above them wasn't taking place in 2023. Somehow, impossibly, they were listening to events from 70 years ago. Sophia's mouth opened wider, and now Elena could hear individual voices clearly. Tommy's higher pitch chattering about finding a bird's nest behind the barn. Margaret's softer tone asking if they could have story time before bed. The words spilled out with the authentic cadence of children who had never learned to doubt that their mother's love was the most reliable force in the universe. "We have to follow them," Elena said, the decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about understanding what had happened to the Whitmore family anymore. It was about preventing history from repeating itself. Sophia was becoming a conduit for something beyond her control, and every moment they remained passive strengthened whatever force was pulling her daughter away from the present. Elena helped Sophia to her feet, alarmed by how little resistance her daughter offered. Sophia moved like someone walking through water, her attention turned inward toward voices only she could fully hear. Elena had seen this kind of dissociation before in trauma patients, the mind's way of protecting itself by retreating from unbearable reality. But this felt different, more like Sophia was being invited somewhere else entirely. They climbed from the hidden room into a living room that looked exactly as Elena remembered it, yet felt fundamentally altered. The storm outside seemed muted now, replaced by sounds that belonged to a different season. Children's laughter echoing from rooms that shouldn't exist, the distant clatter of dishes being set for dinner, the whistle of a kettle that Elena didn't own. "Can you hear her?" Sophia asked dreamily, still speaking in her own voice but with an odd, antiquated cadence. "She's singing in the kitchen. She always sings when she's happy." Elena strained her ears and caught it. A woman's voice humming a melody she didn't recognize, something sweet and melancholic that seemed to drift from the direction of her kitchen. But when she looked that way, all she saw was darkness and the faint gleam of her unpacked boxes. "Sophia, I need you to listen to my voice," Elena said firmly, drawing on every technique she'd learned for reaching patients in crisis. "You're here with me in 2023. Your name is Sofia Vasquez. Your father was David, and he died in a car accident 2 years ago. We moved to this house together, just the two of us." For a moment, Sophia's eyes focused on Elena's face with startling clarity. "But they're so lonely, Mom. They've been waiting so long for someone to see them, to acknowledge that they existed. Margaret keeps asking when her mama is coming back, and Tommy pretends he's not scared, but he is. He's just a little boy." Elena felt her heart breaking for children who had been dead for decades, and for her daughter who was somehow carrying their grief like stones in her chest. The boundary between past and present was dissolving, and Sophia stood at the center of the collapse, too compassionate to protect herself from the weight of others' sorrow. "Where is their mother?" Elena asked, accepting the reality of what was happening even as her rational mind screamed protests. "What happened to Sarah?" Sophia's expression grew troubled, shadows flickering across her face like clouds passing over sunlight. She tried to save them. When the sickness came, she tried so hard, but sometimes love isn't enough, and trying to hold on to people who are already gone will break your heart into pieces so small they become dust. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Sarah Whitmore hadn't just lost her children, she'd fought against their death so desperately that it had shattered her grip on reality. Just as Elena had fought to save David in those final moments after the accident, performing CPR on a man whose injuries were already incompatible with life. Just as she was fighting now to save Sophia from being pulled into a tragedy that had ended before her daughter was even born. Above them, Elena's voice called again, "Children, where did you go?" But now the tone was different, worried, searching, with an edge of panic that Elena recognized from her own worst nights. This was the voice of a mother who was beginning to realize that calling for her children would never bring them back. Sophia took a step toward the stairs, and Elena knew with terrible certainty that if her daughter climbed those steps, she might never come back down. Elena lunged forward, catching Sophia's arm just as her daughter's foot touched the bottom step. The contact sent a shock through both of them, not physical but something deeper, like touching a live wire of accumulated grief. For a split second, Elena saw through Sophia's eyes into a world where the stairs led up to bedrooms filled with children's voices, where a mother's love had become a prison that trapped the dead and the living alike. "No," Elena said, her voice cutting through the phantom sounds like a blade. "We don't follow her path. Not tonight. Not ever." Sophia turned back, and Elena saw her own daughter warring with something else, some part of Sarah Whitmore that had been waiting 70 years for another mother to understand her desperation. The recognition hit Elena like ice water. This wasn't just about the children. This was about her. Sarah Whitmore hadn't just lost her mind when her children died. She had made a choice, the same choice Elena had been making every night since David's death, to retreat from unbearable reality into a space where love could exist without loss, where medication could blur the edges of grief until it felt manageable. "She's still here," Sophia whispered, but now Elena couldn't tell if her daughter was talking about Sarah or about herself. She never left the house because leaving would mean accepting they were gone. She created a place where they could stay children forever, where the sickness never came, where supper time lasted for eternity. Elena's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the pale glow from Sophia's light. In that moment of vulnerability, Elena felt the house around them shift like a living thing, walls breathing with the rhythm of someone deep in medicinal sleep. The air grew thick with the scent of something sweet and cloying, not decay, but preservation. The smell of time held in amber. "Show me," Elena said, the words emerging before she could stop them. "Show me what you see." Sophia's flashlight beam swung toward the kitchen, and Elena followed despite every instinct screaming at her to run. As they walked, the familiar layout of her house began to change. Rooms stretched longer than they should. Doorways appeared where walls had been moments before. The kitchen, when they reached it, was both exactly as Elena had left it and completely transformed. Her unpacked boxes were still there, but now they coexisted with gleaming 1950 seconds appliances, a mint-green refrigerator humming contentedly, a gas stove where something that smelled like bread and honey was baking. The table Elena had never gotten around to buying stood in the center of the room, set for four with cheerful yellow plates. And standing at the stove, her back to them, was Elena herself. Not Sophia channeling voices, not a hallucination brought on by medication withdrawal. Elena was looking at her own body, wearing clothes she'd never owned. A house dress from another era, her hair styled in victory rolls she'd only seen in old photographs. The other Elena hummed while she stirred something in a pot, moving with the unconscious grace of someone who had performed these domestic rituals thousands of times. "She doesn't know they're dead," Sophia said softly. "She's been making dinner every night for 70 years, waiting for them to come home from playing." The medication helped her forget, helped her create a space where the worst thing that ever happened could be erased and rewritten. Elena understood with crystal clarity that she was looking at her own future, not the supernatural echo of Sarah Whitmore, but the logical endpoint of her own choices. Every night she'd chosen numbness over feeling, pharmaceutical sleep over the raw work of grief. She'd been walking the same path that had led Sarah to this eternal kitchen, where love had curdled into something that trapped rather than healed. The other Elena turned around, and her face was Elena's own, but somehow hollowed out, worn smooth by decades of repetition. Her eyes held the glassy contentment of someone perpetually medicated, someone who had chosen not to wake up. "There you are, darlings," she said, looking right through them to see children who existed only in the spaces between heartbeats. I was worried when you didn't come for supper. You must be hungry." Sophia stepped forward, drawn by the maternal warmth in that voice, and Elena realized this was the test, not just of her courage, but of her commitment to living in the world as it actually was, even when that world was saturated with loss. She could follow Sophia into this preserved pocket of denial where David might be just running late from work and grief was something that happened to other people. Or she could choose the harder path, accepting that love sometimes meant letting go, that healing required feeling the full weight of what had been lost. Elena reached for Sophia's hand, her back screaming in protest, her whole body craving the chemical peace of her medication. But for the first time in 2 years, she chose the pain, chose consciousness over comfort, truth over the beautiful lie of a dinner that would never end. "Sophia," she said firmly, "we're leaving, now." Sophia's hand slipped from Elena's grasp like water through her fingers. "But Mom," Sophia said, her voice carrying that same dreamy quality that had been growing stronger all evening. "She's making honey bread, just like you used to make for me when I was little, before Dad died, before everything got broken." Elena felt her heart fracture at the accusation hidden in those words. When had she stopped making honey bread? When had she stopped doing any of the small rituals that had once made their house feel like a home? The other Elena at the stove smiled and began slicing the golden loaf, steam rising from its crust like incense. "Stay for dinner, darling," the medicated version of herself said, still looking through them at phantoms. "There's plenty for everyone. We're a family here. We take care of each other." Sophia moved another step toward the table, and Elena lunged forward, her back seizing with such violence that she nearly collapsed. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot spike that drove up her spine and exploded behind her eyes. Without her medication, her body was remembering every injury from the accident, every torn muscle and compressed nerve that pills had allowed her to ignore. "Sophia, please," Elena gasped, but her daughter was already pulling out a chair at the impossible table. "Just for a little while," Sophia said, settling into the seat with a sigh of relief. "I'm so tired of being scared all the time. Scared you'll take too many pills. Scared you'll disappear into that medicated fog and never come back. Scared I'll come home from school one day and find you like Grandma found her mother." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd thought she'd hidden her struggles so well that Sophia didn't know about the nights Elena sat staring at the pill bottle, counting and recounting, wondering if the pain of living might finally outweigh the fear of dying. She'd thought Sophia didn't remember the stories about Elena's grandmother, who had chosen pills over the unbearable weight of consciousness. "Here you go, sweetheart," the other Elena said, placing a plate in front of Sophia. The honey bread looked perfect, golden and warm, the kind of comfort food that promised to make everything better. "Eat up, you're much too thin." Sophia picked up the bread, and Elena watched in horror as her daughter's edges began to blur, becoming translucent like an old photograph fading in sunlight. The house was claiming her, pulling her into the same preserved space where Sarah Whitmore had trapped herself and her dead children. Elena forced herself forward despite the agony in her back, reaching for Sophia just as her daughter took the first bite. The moment Elena's hand touched Sophia's shoulder, the kitchen shattered around them like broken glass. They were standing in Elena's actual kitchen, dark, cold, filled with unpacked boxes and the lingering smell of mold from water damage. Sophia's chair was empty air. The perfect family dinner was gone. But Sophia herself was fading, becoming more ghost than girl, caught between worlds like a photograph double exposed. "I can't reach her," Elena whispered, her hand passing through Sophia's shoulder. "She's already too far away." From somewhere in the darkness she heard her daughter's voice, distant and growing more so. "It doesn't hurt here, Mom. The grief doesn't live here. We can be happy again." Elena understood with devastating clarity that this was her fault. Every night she'd chosen numbness over presence. Every moment she'd let medication steal her consciousness. She'd been teaching Sophia that the answer to unbearable pain was retreat. Her daughter had learned from watching her that love meant holding on no matter the cost, that letting go was a form of abandonment. Now Sophia was disappearing into the same trap that had claimed Sarah Whitmore, and Elena was losing her just as surely as she'd lost David. But this time, the loss was preventable. This time, Elena was the one making the choice to let go or hold on. The pill bottle in her pocket felt impossibly heavy. 2 years of chemical comfort, of borrowed peace that came at the cost of really living. Elena could take the pills right now, let the pharmaceutical fog roll over her consciousness until this nightmare became someone else's problem. She could follow Sophia into that preserved space where dinner lasted forever and grief was just a word. Or she could accept that saving Sophia meant accepting her own pain, all of it, unmedicated and unfiltered, the full weight of loving someone in a world where loss was inevitable. Elena pulled the pill bottle from her pocket with shaking hands. In the darkness of her broken kitchen, with her daughter fading into the spaces between heartbeats, she made her choice. The pills scattered across the floor like fallen stars, each one a small death she refused to die. "Sophia," she called into the growing silence, "I choose you. I choose now." But her daughter was already gone, and Elena stood alone in the dark, having lost the most precious thing in the world, just as she finally found the courage to fight for it. The house settled around her with satisfied creaks, and somewhere in its walls she could hear the faint sound of children laughing. The laughter echoed through the walls like water finding cracks in stone, and Elena understood with brutal clarity that it wasn't just the Whitmore children she was hearing. It was Sophia's voice weaving through theirs, already becoming part of their eternal chorus. The sound should have driven her to her knees, but instead it ignited something fierce and primal in her chest. Elena dropped to the floor, feeling among the scattered pills with desperate fingers, not to take them but to count them. 37 capsules of borrowed unconsciousness, 37 small surrenders that had taught her daughter the wrong lesson about survival. Each pill represented a night Elena had chosen absence over presence, numbness over the raw work of healing. But as her hand closed around the last capsule, she felt something else, a folded piece of paper that must have fallen from her pocket with the medication. Her fingers recognized the texture even in darkness. The journal page she'd found in the hidden room, the one with her handwriting describing a life she'd never lived. Elena fumbled for her backup flashlight, the cheap drugstore one she'd forgotten in her jacket pocket. Its weak beam illuminated handwriting that was unmistakably hers, but the words belonged to someone else entirely. "David came home early today with flowers, yellow roses because he knows they're my favorite. Sophia helped me make honey bread, standing on her step stool, flower in her hair and that gap-toothed smile that makes my heart hurt with how much I love her. We ate dinner by the window, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, perfect moments like captured butterflies, too beautiful to last." Elena's breath caught. This wasn't Sarah Whitmore's journal, it was hers, or rather, it was the journal she might have written if she'd chosen differently after David's death, if she'd documented joy instead of drowning it, if she'd preserved love instead of medicating it into manageable numbness. The house wasn't just showing her the past, it was showing her the future she was creating. One where Sophia disappeared into preserved perfection because Elena had taught her that the present moment was too painful to endure without chemical assistance. "I know what you are," Elena whispered to the walls around her. Her voice sounded strange in the darkness, stronger than it had in months. "You're not haunted, you're addicted." The house shuddered around her, floorboards creaking like joints under strain. Elena pressed her palm against the wall and felt it, a pulse slow and drugged, the rhythm of a heart kept beating by artificial means. The house itself was on life support, sustained by the psychic energy of people too damaged to let go, too medicated to fully live. Sarah Whitmore hadn't died here. She'd become here, dissolving into the walls and foundations until her grief became the house's foundation. Every subsequent tragedy, every person who'd chosen pills over pain, numbness over healing, had fed the structure, making it stronger, more seductive in its promise of perfect preservation. And now it wanted Sophia, not because she was psychic or special, but because she carried the same genetic predisposition toward medicated escape that had claimed Elena's grandmother, that had nearly claimed Elena herself. The house was a predator that fed on inherited trauma, on families who loved so hard they couldn't learn to let go. The children's laughter grew louder, and Elena heard Sophia's voice more clearly now. "Mama, come play with us. It doesn't hurt here. Nothing ever hurts here." Elena stood, her spine screaming in protest, and spoke directly to the darkness. "Yes, it does hurt. It hurts everywhere, all the time, and that's how I know I'm still alive." The house went silent. "You hear me?" Elena called, her voice growing stronger. "Pain is information. Grief is love with nowhere to go, and I choose both over your perfect, preserved nothing." She walked toward the sound of children's laughter, no longer following Sophia into the trap, but pursuing her daughter with the kind of focused determination she'd once brought to saving lives in the emergency room. Elena had spent 2 years running from her own strength, but she remembered now how it felt to fight for someone else's survival. The hidden room's entrance appeared before her like a mouth opening, and Elena descended without hesitation. The space below pulsed with soft light that seemed to emanate from the toys themselves, dozens of pristine playthings that had never been touched by children's hands, never broken by real love. Sophia sat in the center of the room, but she was no longer alone. 3 other children surrounded her, 2 boys and a girl, their faces glowing with the artificial health of preserved youth. They looked exactly like the photographs Elena had found, but their eyes held depths no child should possess, the weight of decades spent in limbo. "They've been waiting," Sophia said without looking up. "All this time, they've been waiting for someone to choose them." Elena knelt beside her daughter, ignoring the fire in her back, and took Sophia's translucent hands in her solid ones. "But I'm not choosing them, baby. I'm choosing you, the real you in the real world, where people die and hearts break and honey bread sometimes burns, because that's what living actually means." Sophia's eyes met hers, and for the first time all night, Elena saw her daughter fighting to return. The connection between their eyes was like a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance. Elena felt Sophia's hands grow more solid in her own, watched color return to her daughter's cheeks as if someone was slowly turning up the saturation on a faded photograph. "I can feel you," Sophia whispered, wonder and relief mixing in her voice. "I can feel you pulling me back." But the other children weren't ready to let go. The boy who looked about 8 reached for Sophia's arm, his touch leaving frost patterns on her skin. "Don't leave us," he pleaded, his voice carrying the hollow echo of decades. "We've been so lonely. We just want someone to play with." Elena understood then what the house had been doing, not just preserving the dead, but creating a perpetual cycle of need. These children weren't evil. They were starving for the kind of love that could only come from someone still fully alive. The house fed on that exchange, growing stronger with each person it claimed. "I know you're lonely," Elena said gently to the boy, never releasing Sophia's hands. "But this isn't the kind of play that heals loneliness. This is the kind that spreads it." The little girl with pigtails shook her head frantically. "Mama Sarah says love means never letting go. She says goodbye is just another word for giving up." Elena's heart clenched with recognition. She'd been teaching Sophia the same destructive lesson, that love meant holding on at any cost, that letting go was abandonment rather than grace. "Sarah was wrong," Elena said, the words feeling like truth spoken for the first time. "Love means wanting someone to be happy, even when their happiness exists somewhere you can't follow." Sophia's form solidified further, and Elena felt the familiar weight of her daughter's hands, warm and real and wonderfully, imperfectly human. But the effort was draining. Elena's back felt like someone was driving spikes between her vertebrae, and without her medication, her body was remembering every injury from the accident with interest. The pain was extraordinary, but it was also real. It connected her to the moment David died, to the grief she'd been medicating away, to every sensation she'd numbed in her desperate quest for manageable feelings. This was the price of consciousness. Not just the good emotions, but all of them, raw and unfiltered. "Mom, you're shaking," Sophia said, worry creeping into her voice as she became more present. "I'm okay," Elena lied, then caught herself. "Actually, I'm not okay. I'm in pain, a lot of pain. But I'm choosing to feel it because the alternative is losing you." One of the preserved boys stepped closer, his expression shifting from need to something like curiosity. "You choose to hurt?" Elena nodded, sweat beading on her forehead as another wave of agony rolled through her spine. "Sometimes love means choosing hurt. Sometimes it means choosing to stay awake when sleep would be easier. Sometimes it means letting people go when holding on would destroy them." As she spoke, Elena felt something shifting in the room's atmosphere. The soft, artificial light was growing dimmer, and the toys scattered around them began to look less pristine, more like the aged artifacts they actually were. The house was losing its grip, but it wasn't giving up without a fight. The walls began to close in, not physically, but psychically, pressing against Elena's consciousness with a weight that felt like drowning. The house was offering her one last chance: take the pills scattered upstairs, let the chemical peace wash over her, and join this eternal family where grief was optional and love never had to face the test of loss. For a moment, Elena wavered. The pain in her back was becoming unbearable, shooting through her nervous system like liquid fire. She could almost taste the bitter relief of her medication, the way it would soften every sharp edge until the world became manageable again. But Sophia was watching her with eyes that held their own kind of strength, the resilience of someone who had learned to survive her mother's absence without becoming absent herself. Elena realized her daughter had been fighting this battle longer than Elena had, staying present and connected even when Elena checked out. "I'm not going to disappear anymore," Elena said, the words directed as much to herself as to Sophia. "I'm going to hurt, and I'm going to heal, and I'm going to be here for all of it." Sophia smiled, the first real smile Elena had seen from her in months, and together they stood. The preserved children watched with expressions that held sadness, but also something like understanding. They had been trapped by someone else's inability to let go, but they recognized the courage it took to choose differently. "Will you be okay?" Sophia asked the boy who had reached for her. He considered this with the gravity of someone far older than his apparent years. "We don't know how to be okay, but maybe we can learn how to be finished." Elena felt the house shudder around them, its foundation of preserved grief finally beginning to crack. She and Sophia climbed toward the world above, toward mourning and medication withdrawal, and the hard work of loving each other without the promise of forever. They had found their strength not in numbness, but in choosing to feel everything. They emerged into Elena's kitchen as dawn broke through the dirty windows, casting everything in harsh, honest light. The scattered pills on the floor looked like what they were: small white lies she'd told herself about survival. Elena's legs nearly buckled as the adrenaline faded, leaving her with the full weight of unmedicated reality. Sophia caught her arm, and Elena was struck by how much stronger her daughter had become during the months when Elena had been chemically absent. "We should clean these up," Sophia said, gesturing at the pills. Elena nodded, but as she knelt to gather them, something fundamental had shifted. These weren't her salvation anymore. They were evidence of how close she'd come to losing everything that mattered. Each capsule felt heavier than it should, weighted with the nights she'd chosen unconsciousness over presence. "I'm going to need help," Elena admitted, the words scraping her throat raw. "With the withdrawal, with learning how to live with pain instead of medicating it away, with being your mother again instead of just surviving in the same house as you." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I've been ready to help for months, Mom. I just didn't know how to reach you." The house groaned around them, and Elena felt it settling differently now, not with the satisfied weight of claimed victims, but with the exhausted sigh of something finally allowing itself to rest. Through the walls, she could hear sounds she'd never noticed before, wind moving through gaps in the foundation, mice scurrying in spaces where they belonged, the natural creaking of wood adjusting to temperature changes. The supernatural preservation was breaking down, but something else was being born in its place, the possibility of actual healing rather than artificial suspension. Elena's phone, forgotten on the counter, buzzed with a text message. The number wasn't in her contacts, but the message made her breath catch. "Are you still alive in there? This is Tom Hendricks. Tried to reach you yesterday about the house's history. Found something you need to see." She showed Sophia the message, and they exchanged a look that held understanding. They'd broken free from the house's immediate trap, but the larger mystery remained. Other people had lived here, died here, disappeared here. Elena's experience with the preserved children wasn't the end of the story. It was the key that might unlock decades of buried truth. "We could leave," Sophia said quietly. "Pack up right now and go back to Reno. Pretend none of this happened." Elena considered it. They could walk away from this place, from the hidden room and the scattered pills and the weight of questions that demanded answers. She could find a new doctor, get a different prescription, return to the manageable numbness that had carried her through 2 years of grief. But as she looked at her daughter, really looked at her, present and unmedicated and awake, Elena realized she'd spent too much of her life running from difficult truths. The accident that killed David, the genetic predisposition toward self-medication that had claimed her grandmother, the slow erosion of her relationship with Sophia, all of it had been survivable only as long as she refused to examine it closely. "No," Elena said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "We're going to finish this. Whatever happened in this house, whoever else got trapped the way we almost did, they deserve to have their story told. And I need to prove to myself that I can see something difficult all the way through." Sophia smiled, and Elena saw David's stubborn streak in her daughter's expression. "Besides," Sophia added, "someone else might buy this place. Some other family dealing with grief they don't know how to handle. We can't let that happen." Elena felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly knocked her over. Her daughter had inherited the best parts of both parents, David's moral clarity and Elena's instinct to protect others, even when protection came at personal cost. Somehow, despite 2 years of Elena's pharmaceutical fog, Sophia had grown into someone who faced hard truths instead of medicating them away. The phone buzzed again. "I'm 20 minutes out. Have coffee ready. This is going to be a long conversation." Elena looked around her kitchen. The scattered medication, the water-stained walls, the boxes she'd never unpacked because staying felt too much like acceptance of David's absence. All of it would need to be dealt with, one honest moment at a time. "I don't know how to do this," Elena admitted. "How to be awake for all of it, how to handle the pain without pills, how to investigate something this dangerous while keeping you safe." Sophia moved to the coffee maker, muscle memory guiding her through motions she must have performed countless times, while Elena was lost in medicated fog. "We'll figure it out," she said with David's confidence. "Together this time." Outside, Elena heard the sound of a truck approaching down their washboard dirt road. Tom Hendricks was coming with answers that would probably lead to more questions, more danger, more reasons to run. Instead, Elena chose to stay and fight. The truck's engine cut off outside, leaving only the whistle of Nevada wind through the eaves. Elena watched through the kitchen window as a man in his 60s climbed out of a battered pickup, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world despite its dangers. Tom Hendricks carried a banker's box under one arm and a manila envelope thick enough to contain a life's worth of secrets. Sophia poured coffee into 3 mismatched mugs, her movements steady despite everything they'd just survived. Elena marveled at her daughter's composure. 2 hours ago, Sophia had been dissolving into the house's hungry preservation, and now she was preparing to host a conversation that might unravel decades of buried truth. "You ready for this?" Sophia asked, setting the mugs on the scarred kitchen table. Elena's back screamed in protest as she straightened, but the pain felt clean somehow, honest information instead of the muffled distress signals she'd been medicating away for months. "I don't think anyone's ever ready to learn their house is a predator," she said, "but we're going to do it anyway." The knock on the front door echoed through rooms that felt fundamentally different now. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by something raw but infinitely more breathable. Elena and Sophia walked together to answer it, and Elena realized this was the first time in 2 years they'd faced an unknown situation as true partners. Tom Hendricks looked like he'd spent sleepless nights wrestling with whatever he'd come to share. His weathered face held the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying dangerous knowledge alone for too long. "Ms. Vasquez," he said, his voice gravelly with age and cigarettes. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here after yesterday." "Yesterday feels like a lifetime ago," Elena replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What did you find?" They settled around the kitchen table, and Tom opened the banker's box with hands that trembled slightly. 43 years I've been investigating what happened in this house," he said. "Started when my sister Mary disappeared here in 1980. She was house-sitting for the family that owned it then, the Colemans. They found her car in the driveway, her purse on the kitchen counter, coffee still warm in the pot. But Mary was gone." Elena felt Sophia's hand slip into hers under the table, solid and real and reassuringly present. "What did the police conclude?" "Runaway. 26-year-old woman with a history of depression, struggling with a recent divorce, easy to write off." Tom's jaw tightened. But Mary wouldn't run. She was seeing a therapist, taking medication, building a life. She was fighting, not fleeing. He pulled out a stack of photographs, spreading them across the table like tarot cards revealing an ugly future. Elena recognized the house in various decades, different paint colors, different vehicles in the driveway, but always the same hungry architecture waiting at the end of the washboard road. 7 families since 1952, Tom continued. All dealt with some kind of loss or trauma before they moved in. Cheap price draws them out here. Isolation feels like peace at first. Then people start disappearing. Sometimes the whole family, sometimes just one member, always the most vulnerable one. Sophia leaned forward, studying a photograph of a young woman standing in their front yard. "That's the girl from the hidden room," she said quietly. "The one with pigtails." Tom's eyes sharpened. "You've seen her?" Elena exchanged a glance with Sophia, then made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. "We need to tell you what happened last night," she said. "All of it. But first I need you to understand, I've been medicating myself into numbness for 2 years. What we experienced might sound like hallucination, but I was more awake last night than I've been since my husband died." She told him everything. The hidden room, the preserved children, the journal entries in her own handwriting describing a life she'd never lived. Tom listened without interruption, his expression growing more grim with each detail. When Elena finished, Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into the manila envelope and pulled out a photograph that made Elena's blood freeze. It was her, standing in the kitchen where they sat now, but wearing clothes she'd never owned, holding Sophia as a toddler she'd never been in this house. The image was professionally shot, with the soft focus of a family portrait, and Elena looked radiantly happy in a way she hadn't felt since David's death. "Found this in Mary's belongings after she disappeared," Tom said softly. "Along with dozens of others showing lives people never lived, families that never existed, happiness that was never real." Elena stared at the photograph, understanding crystallizing like ice in her veins. The house didn't just preserve its victims, it created false histories for them. Elaborate fantasy lives to make the preservation feel like salvation rather than imprisonment. "It's not just feeding on trauma," Elena whispered. "It's promising to rewrite it." Sophia gripped her hand tighter. "What do we do with something like that?" Tom smiled for the first time since arriving, and it transformed his weathered face. "We burn it down," he said simply. "Literally. Tonight, before it can claim anyone else." Elena felt everything she'd learned crystallizing into purpose. The house had shown her the choice between numb preservation and painful growth. Now it was time to choose for everyone who'd never gotten the chance. Elena felt the house react to Tom's words like a living thing sensing mortal threat. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds, and every window in the kitchen rattled despite the absence of wind. Coffee cups trembled on the table as something massive shifted beneath the floorboards. "It knows," Sophia whispered, her grip on Elena's hand tightening. "It knows what we're planning." The lights flickered, then died completely, plunging them into the grey half-light of storm clouds that had appeared from nowhere. Through the windows, Elena watched their 40 acres of sagebrush bend flat under supernatural wind that howled with voices she recognized. All the people who'd disappeared here, all the children preserved in the hidden room, calling out in desperate warning. Tom was already moving, pulling flares and a jerry can of gasoline from his banker's box with the efficiency of someone who'd planned this moment for decades. "It's going to fight us," he said grimly. "The house won't let us destroy it without—" The floor beneath Elena's chair gave way. She plummeted through splintering wood into darkness that shouldn't exist, landing hard on stone that knocked the breath from her lungs. Above her she could hear Sophia screaming her name, but the opening had already sealed itself, leaving Elena trapped in a space that felt infinite and suffocating simultaneously. "Welcome home, Elena." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, feminine and familiar. Elena struggled to her feet, her back shrieking in protest, and found herself facing a woman who looked exactly like her, but wearing the clothes from the impossible photograph. This other Elena glowed with the same artificial preservation as the children, her skin too perfect, her smile too constant. "You can stop fighting now," the doppelganger said gently. "I know how tired you are, how much it hurts to keep choosing consciousness over peace. You don't have to carry that burden anymore." Around them, the hidden room had expanded into a vast replica of Elena's life, as it should have been. David stood in the corner, unbroken by the accident, smiling with the warmth she'd spent 2 years medicating herself to forget. Sophia moved between them, still a child who'd never had to watch her mother disappear into pharmaceutical fog. "Is what you really want," the other Elena continued. "A world where David never died, where you never got hurt, where Sophia never had to grow up too fast because her mother checked out. I can give you that. We can all be happy here." Elena felt the terrible pull of it, not just the promise of painlessness, but the deeper seduction of a life without consequences. No withdrawal to endure, no grief to process, no difficult conversations with Sophia about the months Elena had been absent while sitting in the same room. Just eternal preservation disguised as love. "It's not real," Elena said, but her voice cracked with longing. "Reality is overrated," David said, stepping forward with his familiar laugh. "Look what reality gave us. My death, your addiction, Sophia's loneliness. Why choose suffering when happiness is possible?" Elena looked at her daughter's preserved face, frozen in childhood innocence, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Because that's not Sophia," she said with growing certainty. "My daughter isn't innocent anymore. She's strong and complicated and angry at me for good reasons. She's growing into someone extraordinary, and you want to trap her in amber before she becomes who she's meant to be." The room shuddered, and cracks appeared in the perfect walls. Above them, Elena heard the sound of splintering wood and Sophia's voice shouting her name with fierce determination. "Sophia," Elena called back. "I'm here. I'm choosing here." Her doppelganger's perfect smile twisted into something predatory. "You're choosing pain. You're choosing loneliness. You're choosing to live without him forever." "I'm choosing truth," Elena replied, surprising herself with the strength in her voice, even when truth hurts, especially when it hurts. The preserved David reached for her with hands that felt like ice. "Elena, please, we could be together again. Isn't that what you want?" For a moment, Elena wavered. The phantom touch was exactly as she remembered, and the promise of erasing 2 years of grief felt like salvation. But then she thought of Sophia's real hand in hers, warm and calloused from guitar practice and strong from learning to survive Elena's absence. "What I want," Elena said, stepping back from the illusion, is to be the mother Sophia actually has, not the one I wish I could be. What I want is to love her enough to let her grow, even when growing means growing away from me." The room began collapsing in on itself, false walls crumbling to reveal the narrow, hidden space beneath the kitchen. Elena heard gasoline splashing overhead and smelled the sharp tang of flares igniting. Tom and Sophia were burning the house down, with or without her. "I choose the fire," Elena said, reaching toward the sound of her daughter's voice. "I choose real love, even when it burns." Above her, the floorboards burst into flame, and Sophia's hand reached down into the light to pull her home. Elena grasped Sophia's hand and felt herself pulled upward through flames that licked at her clothes, but somehow didn't burn. The house screamed around them, a sound like tearing metal and breaking glass that seemed to come from the walls themselves. As Elena's feet found solid ground in what remained of her kitchen, she saw Tom backing toward the door, flare gun raised, his face grim with purpose. "The whole foundation is rotted through with whatever this thing is," he shouted over the supernatural wind that howled through broken windows. "We have to get out, now!" But Elena couldn't move. Standing in the doorway to the living room were all the children from the hidden space, no longer preserved in artificial perfection. They looked as they should have, aged, weathered, some bearing the marks of whatever violence had originally claimed them. The girl with pigtails stepped forward, her eyes holding decades of trapped awareness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 40 years. "We've been waiting so long to say goodbye." Behind her, Elena saw Mary Hendricks, Tom's sister, wearing the clothes she disappeared in but finally free of the house's hungry preservation. "Tell Tom," Mary said, tears streaming down her face. "Tell him I fought as long as I could. Tell him I'm proud of who he became." The house shuddered, and Elena realized what the cost of victory would be. To truly destroy this place, to ensure it could never again trap families seeking escape from trauma, she would have to give up the one thing she'd been desperately clinging to, the possibility that somehow, someday, her pain might simply disappear. "Mom, we have to go!" Sophia pulled at her arm as burning timber began falling from the ceiling. Elena looked at her daughter's face, streaked with soot and fierce with love, and made the hardest choice of her life. She pulled the bottle of oxycodone from her pocket, the pills she'd been rationing, the chemical safety net that had promised to catch her if the pain became unbearable, and threw it into the flames. "I'm choosing this," she said, watching her last pharmaceutical escape route curl and blacken. All of it, the grief, the pain, the work of getting better without shortcuts. The house convulsed as if mortally wounded. Through the smoke, Elena saw her doppelganger one final time, no longer perfect but desperate, reaching toward her with hands that were already dissolving. "You'll regret this," the other Elena cried. "When the pain gets too bad, when you can't sleep, when you remember what it felt like to be numb, you'll wish you'd stayed." "Maybe," Elena admitted, taking Sophia's hand. "But I'll wish it while I'm alive." They ran through rooms that were collapsing into themselves, past photographs that showed false histories bursting into flame, down hallways that stretched and contracted like the throat of a dying beast. Tom waited by his truck, engine running, Mary's photograph clutched against his chest. Elena threw herself into the passenger seat as Sophia dove into the back, and Tom gunned the engine just as the roof collapsed entirely. In the rearview mirror, Elena watched 40 years of accumulated hunger and false promise burn itself to ash, taking with it every shortcut she'd ever imagined might exist between trauma and healing. "It's over," Sophia breathed, and Elena heard wonder in her daughter's voice, not just at their survival, but at the recognition that they'd chosen the harder path and survived it together. As they drove away down the washboard road, Elena felt withdrawal beginning in her body. The sweats, the nausea, the bone-deep ache that would be her companion for weeks as she learned to live without chemical buffers. But she also felt something else, Sophia's hand in hers, warm and real and absolutely present. "I need to tell you," Elena said, her voice steady despite everything. "I've been taking too many pills, more than prescribed. I'm going to get sick getting off them, and I'm going to need help. Sophia squeezed her hand. I know, Mom. I've known for months. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her daughter's awareness, the burden Sophia had been carrying while Elena drifted through medicated fog. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know that too, Sophia said, but we're going to fix it, together this time. Behind them, smoke rose from what had been their house, carrying with it the trapped souls of decades' worth of victims finally free to rest. Elena had sacrificed her safety net, her chemical escape route, her carefully maintained numbness. In return, she'd won something infinitely more valuable, the chance to love her daughter with full consciousness, even when consciousness hurt. The pain would come, grief for David, withdrawal from the pills, the hard work of rebuilding trust with Sophia. But Elena would meet it awake, present, and alive. She'd chosen fire over preservation, growth over comfort, truth over the beautiful lie of pharmaceutical peace. It was the hardest choice she'd ever made, and the only one that could save them both. The morning after felt like waking up in a different world. Elena sat in a booth at Ruby's Diner in Dusty Creek's tiny downtown, watching Sophia methodically work through a stack of pancakes while Tom Hendricks nursed his third cup of coffee. Through the greasy window, she could see the smoke columns still rising from their direction, a dark smudge against the Nevada sky that marked the end of something that should never have existed. Elena's hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup, the first obvious sign that her body was beginning to protest the absence of oxycodone. She'd taken her last pill 16 hours ago, and already the familiar ache was spreading through her bones like ice water. But this time, the pain felt different, clean, somehow, honest. The sheriff's going to want a statement, Tom said quietly, his weathered fingers drumming against the Formica table. House fires are investigated, especially when they're this complete. Elena nodded, though the thought of explaining last night to anyone who hadn't lived it felt impossible. How do you tell a law enforcement officer that you burned down a house because it was feeding on trauma and preserving victims like insects in amber? How do you describe a hidden room that existed in spaces between spaces, or a journal that wrote itself in your handwriting? We'll figure it out, Sophia said, looking up from her pancakes. There was something different in her daughter's voice, not just maturity, but a kind of steady confidence that Elena didn't remember from before. We'll tell them what we can and handle whatever comes next. Elena studied her daughter's face, really seeing it for the first time in months. Sophia looked older than her 17 years, but not in the brittle way of children forced to grow up too fast. This was different, the kind of aging that came from surviving something terrible with your humanity intact. When did you get so wise? Elena asked softly. Sophia's smile was complicated, carrying shades of forgiveness and wariness in equal measure. Someone had to be the grown-up while you were checked out. I figured I'd keep practicing until you came back. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch away from them. This was part of choosing consciousness, accepting the full weight of what her absence had cost, even when that weight threatened to crush her. Tom cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to practical matters. I've got a cabin about 30 miles east of here, he said. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and isolated enough that you won't have neighbors asking questions while you recover. Elena met his eyes, understanding the offer for what it really was. A safe place to go through withdrawal, away from the judgment of strangers and the temptation of easy pharmaceutical solutions. Why are you helping us? Because you did what I've been trying to do for 43 years, Tom replied simply. You saved my sister. You saved all of them. His voice cracked slightly. Mary looked peaceful when I saw her in those flames, like she'd been holding her breath all this time and could finally exhale. Elena remembered Mary Hendricks' face in those final moments, aged and weathered but unmistakably free. The house had preserved her body but never her awareness, trapping her in decades of conscious imprisonment while her brother searched for answers that seemed impossible until last night. I'm going to write about it, Sophia announced suddenly, her fork clattering against her plate. Not for publication or anything, but for us. so we remember what actually happened when people try to convince us it was just grief or pills or whatever normal explanation they come up with. Elena felt a surge of fierce pride mixed with protective terror. Sophia had inherited David's stubborn commitment to truth, his refusal to accept comfortable lies when uncomfortable reality was available. It was the quality Elena had fallen in love with, and the one that terrified her most in their daughter. "Just be careful who you trust with that story," Elena said. "Some truths are too dangerous for people who aren't ready to hear them. Like the truth about how many pills you were taking?" Sophia's voice held no accusation, just steady observation. "I protected that secret for months, Mom. I can handle protecting this one too." Elena's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as another wave of withdrawal tremors hit. Sophia reached across the table without hesitation, covering Elena's shaking hand with her own steady one. The gesture was so naturally protective that Elena felt tears threatening. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Elena warned, her voice thick with approaching emotion. "I know," Sophia said simply, "but worse is still better than numb." Through the diner window, Elena watched the last of the smoke dissipate into clear sky. Somewhere beneath the ashes lay the remains of a trap that had claimed decades of victims, all of them seeking escape from unbearable realities. Elena had chosen fire over preservation, consciousness over comfort, and the price was just beginning. But sitting here with Sophia's hand anchoring her to the present moment, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death, hope that felt real rather than chemically induced. They had survived the house, and they would survive what came next, together, awake, and absolutely alive. Elena's hand trembled slightly as she set down her empty coffee cup, but this time she didn't try to hide the shaking. 3 weeks had passed since the fire, 3 weeks of withdrawal symptoms that had stripped her down to bone and sinew and rebuilt her from the inside out. The tremors were mostly gone now, replaced by something infinitely more valuable, the ability to feel everything without needing to escape it. "You ready for this?" Sophia asked from the passenger seat of Tom's borrowed truck. They were parked outside the offices of Henderson and Associates, the law firm handling David's estate, business Elena had been too medicated to handle for 2 years. Elena studied her daughter's profile against the Las Vegas skyline. Sophia wore the same clothes she'd had on the night they fled the burning house, but she carried herself differently now. There was a groundedness to her that hadn't existed before, as if surviving their ordeal together had given her access to reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. "I think so," Elena said honestly, "though I'm not sure I'll ever feel ready for anything again, just capable of doing it anyway." They walked into the air-conditioned lobby together, and Elena felt the familiar spike of anxiety that had once sent her reaching for pill bottles. But now she breathed through it, let it exist without trying to medicate it away. The sensation was uncomfortable but manageable, like learning to walk on a broken bone that had finally healed correctly. "Mrs. Vasquez." James Henderson rose from behind his mahogany desk, his expression carefully professional but tinged with something that might have been relief. "I have to say, you look different." Elena almost laughed. Different didn't begin to cover it. She'd lost 15 pounds during withdrawal, her hair had gone grey at the temples from stress, and her skin bore the weathered look of someone who'd stared directly into trauma without pharmaceutical filters. But her eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been since David's funeral. "I'm clean," she said simply, "from the pain medication. It's been 3 weeks. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly. Elena realized he'd probably been wondering for months whether she was competent to handle legal decisions, watching her drift through appointments in medicated fog, while Sophia sat silently protective beside her. "That's excellent news," he said carefully. "There are several matters we need to discuss regarding David's life insurance policy and some investment accounts you'll need to access." As Henderson spread papers across his desk, Elena felt Sophia's hand slip into hers under the table. The gesture was casual, natural, but Elena recognized it for what it truly was, her daughter grounding her in the present moment, offering strength without being asked. For the next hour, Elena made decisions she'd been avoiding for 2 years. She signed papers to access David's retirement account, approved the disbursement of his life insurance policy, and established a college fund for Sophia that would ensure her daughter's future remained secure regardless of Elena's own struggles. "There's one more thing," Henderson said as they prepared to leave. "The house insurance claim. The adjuster's report concluded that the fire was caused by faulty electrical wiring in an old structure. The payout should cover your mortgage completely, with enough left over for a fresh start." Elena nodded, unsurprised that the official explanation bore no resemblance to reality. Some truths were too large for paperwork, too impossible for insurance adjusters trained to categorize disasters into familiar boxes. Outside the law office, Elena and Sophia stood blinking in the bright Nevada sunshine. Elena felt the phantom weight of pill bottles in her purse, the muscle memory of reaching for pharmaceutical comfort when faced with difficult emotions. But the bottles weren't there, would never be there again, and she was learning to carry grief and anxiety and hope all at the same time. "I want to visit Dad's grave," Elena said suddenly. "I haven't been since the funeral. I was too absent." Sophia squeezed her hand. "I've been going every few weeks, talking to him about you mostly, about how scared I was that I was losing both of you." Elena felt tears threaten, but this time she didn't try to blink them away. Crying was just another sensation to experience fully, another proof that she was alive and present and capable of feeling love so deep it threatened to break her open. They drove to the cemetery in comfortable silence, Tom's truck navigating familiar streets that Elena was seeing clearly for the first time in months. At David's graveside, Elena knelt and placed her hand on the headstone, feeling sun-warmed granite against her palm. "I chose to live," she whispered, speaking to David but meaning the words for herself. "It hurt more than dying would have, but I chose it anyway, for her, for us, for the chance to love her the way you would have wanted me to." Sophia knelt beside her, and together they sat with David's memory, not the preserved, artificial version the house had offered, but the real man who died too young and left them to figure out how to survive love that had nowhere left to go except deeper into their own hearts. When they finally stood to leave, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since the accident, the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today, that healing might actually be possible if she stayed conscious long enough to do the work. The new beginning. 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of their small apartment in Carson City, watching Sophia pack sandwiches for their weekly hike in the Sierra foothills. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated dust motes that danced like tiny spirits, but Elena no longer flinched at such fanciful thoughts. She'd learned to distinguish between imagination and hallucination, between the natural magic of being fully present and the dangerous allure of escape. "You remembered the trail mix," Sophia observed, hefting Elena's backpack to test its weight. "And the first aid kit, and the extra water bottles, and your inhaler even though you haven't needed it in years," Elena replied, earning an exaggerated eye roll from her daughter. "Some habits die hard." The truth was, Elena's hypervigilance had transformed from anxiety into genuine care. Where once she'd medicated away her protective instincts, now she channeled them into practical love, ensuring Sophia ate enough, slept enough, felt heard and valued, and absolutely secure in her mother's presence. Their apartment was small, 2 bedrooms on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian, but it felt spacious in ways the ranch house never had. Every corner held light instead of shadows, every room served its intended purpose without hidden meanings or secret histories. Elena had chosen it specifically for its ordinariness. No architectural mysteries, no tragic past, just honest walls containing honest lives. The insurance money from the house fire had provided more than fresh start funds. It had offered choices. Elena could have bought another house, something larger and more permanent. Instead, she'd chosen flexibility. Apartments could be left behind if necessary. Leases could be broken if staying became too difficult. She'd learned that stability came from internal resources rather than external structures. Dr. Chen called yesterday, Sophia mentioned casually, though Elena caught the careful tone that meant her daughter was testing emotional waters. She said the physical therapy program in Sacramento has an opening if you're interested. Elena paused in her packing. Dr. Chen was the pain management specialist who'd helped her navigate withdrawal without relapsing, who'd taught her to work with chronic pain rather than simply medicating it away. The Sacramento program would mean returning to nursing, not emergency medicine, which required physical stamina Elena no longer possessed, but rehabilitation work with other patients recovering from trauma. "What do you think?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about Sophia's opinion. Their relationship had evolved into something closer to partnership since the fire, built on honesty and mutual respect rather than protective deception. "I think you miss helping people," Sophia said simply. "And I think you're good at understanding what it feels like when everything hurts." Elena felt the familiar ache in her lower back, the constant reminder of the accident that had killed David and shattered her spine. But the pain no longer felt like an enemy to be defeated or a sentence to be endured. It was simply part of her landscape now, like having brown eyes or being 5'6", a permanent characteristic that influenced but didn't define her choices. "The program would mean starting college early for you," Elena said. "Sacramento City College has excellent transfer agreements with UC schools." Sophia's face lit with the kind of excitement Elena hadn't seen since before the accident. "You'd really consider it?" "I'd really consider anything that lets us move forward together," Elena replied, and realized she meant it completely. The woman who'd bought a ranch house to hide from reality would never have imagined choosing uncertainty over safety, growth over comfort. But that woman had been preserved in pharmaceutical amber, protected from change by chemicals that also prevented healing. They drove to the trailhead with windows down, desert air carrying sense of sage and possibility. Elena's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, her thoughts clear and focused on the present moment. 6 months of sobriety had taught her that consciousness was a daily choice, not a destination. She woke each morning and chose awareness over numbness, engagement over escape. The hiking trail wound through pine trees that whispered with honest wind, not the supernatural howling Elena had once mistaken for atmosphere. They climbed steadily, Elena's pace limited by physical reality but her spirit unlimited by chemical constraints. When she needed to rest, she rested. When Sophia wanted to explore side paths, they explored. The day unfolded according to their authentic desires rather than pharmaceutical schedules. At the summit, they shared lunch while looking out over the valley where they'd built their new life. Elena pulled out her phone and called Dr. Chen's office, leaving a message about the Sacramento program, while Sophia grinned beside her. "Dad would be proud," Sophia said, as Elena ended the call. "He'd be surprised," Elena admitted. "I'm not sure he ever saw me as someone who could choose difficult things over easy ones." "Maybe you couldn't before," Sophia replied. "But you can now." Elena wrapped her arm around her daughter, feeling the solid warmth of a future they would face together. Awake, aware, and absolutely committed to choosing life, even when life chose to be hard. The ranch house was ash and memory, but they had survived its destruction to become something neither of them had imagined possible, a family rebuilt on truth instead of preservation, love instead of protection, hope instead of pharmaceutical peace. They were finally completely alive.